Huawei is at the center of this diplomatic dust-up. Canada's arrest of the company's CFO is widely believed to have prompted China's arrest of 2 Canadians. While other countries have banned or limited the tech firm's footprint, Canada hasn't, despite warnings from the U.S. that Huawei could threaten this country's national security. Could those concerns affect Canada's relationship with the United States? Mark Warner is a Democratic senator from Virginia and the vice chair of the U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee. He joins me now from Washington. Hi, Senator Warner. Nice to see you. Thanks for making time for the program.
My pleasure, Vashi.
Senator, you have repeatedly characterized Chinese telecommunications giant Huawei as a national security threat. What is it specifically about the company that has you so worried?
Well, let me first of all step back and acknowledge that 4 or 5 years ago, I didn't have this level of concern about China as a whole and Huawei and some of the Chinese telecom companies in specifics. And my background was actually in industry. I was in the telecom industry and the wireless business, so I'm a little more familiar than most elected officials. But what I've continually seen from the American intelligence community, and not just the American intelligence community, we've seen the same from the Australians and the New Zealanders, is all reached the conclusions that these Chinese telecom companies are not traditional private sector companies the way we might think of Bell Canada or a Verizon in the U.S. These Chinese telecom companies are directly influenced by the Chinese government. They are not necessarily direct arms of the government, but the government and the Communist Party has the ability to influence their capabilities. And my specific concerns are, particularly as we move into the next generation of wireless, the so-called 5G networks, that if a country were to purchase this equipment, it might have built-in back doors so that down the line, once the equipment was installed, the Chinese could intercept messages, communications, violate the security of the networks. And our committee, separate from the Trump administration, and I understand there are huge concerns, and I think the Trump administration's dealings with Canada in many ways have been inappropriate. So that's why Senator Rubio and I, in a bipartisan way, said, we have such a close relationship with Canada, let's reach out and try to at least put on notice that Huawei, ZTE, these telecom companies, particularly as we get into 5G, could pose a national security threat to Canada. We've reached that conclusion already in America, as has, again, Australia, New Zealand, and even our friends, the British, have made a change on the equipment as well. And we're seeing other nations re-examine their positions as well. So Canada, where our networks are so intertwined, we wanted to raise this issue at the Prime Minister level.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask. Of course, you're referring to the idea that Canada is conducting a review of 5G technology. You wrote a letter specifically to the Prime Minister, as you said, with Senator Rubio. Why did you feel like it was necessary to comment on something happening in Canada? What is of such great importance to the United States from your perspective?
Well, there are no two countries that are closer connected than the United States and Canada, number one. Number two, our telecom networks are totally meshed together. And if there was a vulnerability in the Canadian system, it would make America vulnerable. Vice versa, if there was a vulnerability in the American system, it would make Canada vulnerable. Number three, we also have a very unique intelligence sharing relationship. Many of your viewers may be familiar with what's called the Five Eyes. It is Canada, the United States, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, the 5 closest allies on intelligence sharing in the world. And because of these unique characteristics, and we again realize that, negotiations or particularly I personally believe that the Trump administration has not been appropriately respectful of Canada in some of our trade conversations, and the president here calling out Canada as a national security threat, which I frankly 100% disagree with. But we felt it was important that we showed to the Canadian government and the Prime Minister in particular that this concern that was being raised about Huawei was not something that was coming out of simply a Trump administration, but was really the consensus of the American intelligence community, of independent bipartisan senators, and was the same conclusion of at least the American telecom industry, the AT&Ts, the Verizons, the Sprints, who've also reached the conclusion that this equipment is vulnerable and could pose a security threat.
What do you think the potential consequences on the relationship between Canada and the U.S. are if Canada, at the end of this review, does permit Huawei to be a part of 5G network infrastructure in this country?
Well, it's hard really to predict because our networks are so closely meshed. How do we, I think there'd almost have to be some level of untangling. And so that, I think it would prove to be a real challenge, I think, both technically and add froth to a relationship that has been stable for so long, but right now is a bit unstable. And I would simply point to my Canadian friends, this is not simply a conclusion of an overly paranoid American intelligence community. This is the same conclusion that Australia has reached, New Zealand has reached. The Brits had made a decision to allow Huawei or to deal with Huawei, but they are in a re-review as well. We've also seen other European countries who've actually been purchasing a lot of Huawei equipment start to re-examine, because I think there is a growing consensus. 2 years ago, while some of this had been in the ether before, it wasn't at the kind of critical phase it is now. So my hope is that the Trudeau government will, if they don't accept our validation, that your intelligence folks, your telecom folks, will talk with our intelligence folks and telecom folks, and I think technically come to the same conclusion that this would be a vulnerability to the Canadian security.
In the past, the head of Canada's Cybersecurity Centre, his name is Scott Jones, has said that Canada doesn't need to ban Huawei because Canada has sort of safeguards in place that other countries don't have. I know that you have written about your disagreement with that assessment. Why do you disagree with it?
Well, this gets a bit technical. The challenge becomes that Huawei equipment may not come with built-in malware, for example. But Huawei has the ability, because of this network construction system, that they will be able to send electronically any kind of upgrade to your system, any kind of upgrade to your switch, any kind of upgrade to your handheld equipment. And in that sending those upgrades, you can plant malware, you can plant a backdoor, you can plant the allowance of ability, in effect, to spy onto Canadians or Canadian government or Canadian national security ability to communicate. And so we think that downstream threat, and at least the experts I've talked to have said, this is an issue that there's been growing consensus on. I mean, again, by no means is the United States pure in this matter. We have had, in terms of current level 4G equipment, the current state of the wireless network, there are American telephone operators, small telco companies, particularly on the United States' northern border, our border with Canada, which have been out purchasing some of the Huawei equipment because it's a lot cheaper. Again, that would raise on one level a reason why is this equipment so much cheaper, other than are the Chinese using this as a way, as kind of a Trojan horse to get into our networks. But we're trying to make this same argument now to even the American companies that have purchased this equipment.
I guess I'm wondering, though, is there any way that Canada has the tools to ward off the kinds of dangers and the consequences that you're talking about, or do you not believe that to be the case?
I do not believe that to be the case. Now, again, I've not done the level of technical review, and I don't have the capability to do the level of technical review. But I would simply point to other nations, and a lot of this activity on Huawei has all happened in the last year. Up until a year ago, the Australians, for example, were looking very strongly at buying this equipment and felt they had some of the safeguards. With further technical review, they determined that they weren't going to be safe and was the first country to put kind of a more absolute ban in place. The New Zealanders followed suit. The British are re-examining this. Again, my sense is, and I know there is some controversy within Canada between current national cyber and cybersecurity experts and previous cybersecurity experts. I would simply ask our Canadian friends to, not just look to our letter, but look to experts around the West who increasingly are finding a pretty uniform consensus that this is a real vulnerability that we don't want to build into our next generation wireless, because the next generation wireless, the so-called 5G network, is so much more dramatically different than previous upgrades in wireless capability. All of the devices that are called the Internet of Things, the refrigerator that's connected, the driverless car, the microwave that's all connected to the internet, will all, in a sense, run on 5G, so that this network, which will go well beyond now simply data and voice communications, will really touch all parts of our life. And I think it's simply to err on the side of greater security rather than coming in after the fact and having to rip out networks. I would simply say to our Canadian friends, please take an extra special look, and don't just take our recommendations. Please look to our allies within the Five Eye alliances.
Senator, the renewed scrutiny on Huawei, at least in this country, was prompted by the Canadian arrest of Huawei's CFO Meng Wanzhou at the request of the U.S. China responded very quickly, condemning the move and subsequently detaining 2 Canadians on allegations that they violated Chinese national security law. How worried are you about the detention of those 2 Canadians?
I'm very worried and concerned, again, that in China there is not really a distinction between government control and private companies. Private companies, especially successful private companies in China, like Huawei, like a number of their tech companies, the Communist Party has deep levels of infiltration. So I do hope that those Canadian citizens can be released. I know the American State Department has put out warnings to, in light of the arrest of the Canadians, to Americans about traveling to China as well, that the Chinese government may take action against a variety of Westerners. So
would you be concerned, Senator, about traveling to China?
I would be.
You would? Yes. Because of this?
I'm particularly concerned because I have, well, not simply because of this. I've been fairly vocal on my comments in trying to candidly alert American investors, American venture capital firms, large American financial institutions, our largest companies, that doing business with China as China presents today poses threats of intellectual property theft, national security threats, as the way Huawei does. And let me be clear, this was not the position I held 3 or 4 years ago. I think we've seen a dramatic change under President Xi, where there's been further consolidation of power in China, where we've seen the Communist Party take a much bigger role in the private sector. And the China that I had hoped for or envisioned 5 or 6 years ago is not the China that I think we're confronting today. And I don't think I'd be a very popular figure to come to China at this point.
You referenced the State Department's comments just before the holidays. They put out a statement expressing, quote, deep concern over the detention of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, the 2 Canadians. Is that enough? Do you think that the U.S. or the administration particularly could be doing more to condemn the actions of China in this case?
Yes, I do. I think the American government should be doing more. And I think if we are going to ask our allies to step up when we see the kind of potential security violations that a Huawei or a ZTE are providing in the telecom area, and when China acts based upon our similar legal systems to arrest a foreign national, I think we need to do more to bring our pressure, as well as other of our allies' pressure, particularly the Five Eyes, the British, the Australians, and the New Zealanders, as well, to bear on trying to get these Canadian citizens released.
What more could be done? What more should be done, specifically?
Well, I think one of the missed opportunities, and again, I'm not a fan of the Trump administration. I feel over the last year to year and a half, there's been a growing consensus in the West, writ large, Europe, America, Canada, the Japanese, the Koreans, that China was operating in the business sphere on different set of rules than the rest of the West, and that there was a real need to call China on the carpet as a first world nation and say, you can't steal intellectual property, you can't have a separate set of rules for your companies over Western companies. You know, you have all the benefits of the so-called WTO, but none of the downside. And there was a chance to put international pressure on China. Unfortunately, as we've seen, the Trump administration instead chose to create uses of our trade language and trade laws to attack China, to attack Mexico, to attack our European allies, and consequently the ability for this president, at least, Mr. Trump, to build that international alliance against China has deteriorated. So I think the Trump administration's credibility on these issues is, particularly in Canada and Europe, is not very high at this point. And one of the reasons, again, why Senator Rubio and I and others are going out and trying to spread the word, saying, even if you don't believe the Trump administration, please believe those of us who have believed in strong international trade, who have some background in the industry, some bipartisan background. That the old America under Obama and Bush and Clinton hasn't completely gone away. We still value these alliances, and one of the reasons why we raise this issue at the level of the Prime Minister's office. And again, understand some of his concerns about outside American intervention, but the issue is so important, we thought it was important to bring it to the Prime Minister's attention directly.
All right, thank you very much for your time, Senator Warner. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.